Sunday mornings are supposed to be predictable. They're supposed to carry the weight of tradition, of family routines, of prayers whispered in unison. In Grand Blanc Township, Michigan, that expectation was shattered on September 28th when an act of unimaginable violence unfolded inside a church. What began as a service of worship ended in fire, bloodshed, and mourning. Authorities say a man drove a pickup truck into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, stormed inside with an assault rifle, and unleashed terror on hundreds of people who had gathered for peace. Before the attack was over, flames engulfed the building, gunfire echoed across the sanctuary, and lives were stolen in mere minutes. At least 5 people were killed, 8 more were injured, and an entire community was thrust into grief and confusion. The suspect, identified as 40-year-old Thomas Jacob Sanford, was a former U.S. Marine, a fact that raises difficult questions about service, reintegration, and the fragility of human stability. His actions, deliberate and devastating, have left investigators searching not just for evidence of how the attack was carried out, but for reasons why a veteran of war would turn on his neighbors in such a calculated way. This was not simply a local tragedy. Within hours, reactions poured in from state leaders, national politicians, federal law enforcement, and religious organizations across the country. What happened in Grand Blanc Township touched a nerve because it represents a deeper, more troubling truth. That even sanctuaries, the places designed for prayer, connection, and healing, are not immune from violence. In this report, we're breaking down 5 key facts: the timeline of the attack, the profile of the shooter, the toll on victims and survivors, the reactions from leaders and communities, and the broader questions that must be asked in the wake of such horror. Each fact is more than information. It's a thread in a larger story that demands attention. Stay with us as we walk through what happened, who was involved, how communities are responding, and what it all means for the future of safety in America's sacred spaces. Sunday morning, September 28th, began like countless others in Grand Blanc Township, Michigan. Families woke, children tugged on their parents' sleeves to hurry them along, churchgoers dressed in their best, and neighbors nodded to each other as they filed in to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was supposed to be a morning of faith, music, and quiet reflection. Instead, in a span of minutes, it descended into chaos, fire, and irrevocable tragedy. At approximately 10:25 a.m., the first sign that something was horribly wrong arrived not with the sound of prayer, but with the roar of a truck engine. A silver Chevrolet Silverado pickup barreled toward the building. Witnesses say it rammed directly into the side of the chapel, tearing through what should have been a sanctuary wall. Panic rippled instantly through the crowd. Those near the impact screamed, others rushed to understand what had just happened, and some instinctively ran toward the exits. Before anyone could process the vehicle attack, the driver emerged. He wasn't staggering in confusion like someone who had made a mistake. He was deliberate, armed, and ready. In his hands was an assault-style rifle, which he raised toward the congregation. In a matter of seconds, gunfire echoed across the sanctuary. Families ducked under pews, mothers shielded their children, and dozens scrambled for the doors. The building that just moments earlier resonated with hymns now reverberated with screams and gunshots. As bullets tore through the space, smoke began to rise. Investigators would later say the attacker carried gasoline or another accelerant and set parts of the church alight. Flames quickly spread, turning the holy space into both a crime scene and a blazing inferno. Those closest to the exits were able to flee, while others inside found themselves trapped between gunfire and smoke. Calls to 911 flooded dispatchers' lines. Officers from the Grand Blanc Township Police Department and the Michigan Department of Natural Resources rushed toward the scene. According to Police Chief William Renier, the first officers arrived within just moments of the initial crash. By 10:33 a.m., less than 10 minutes after the truck rammed into the chapel, the shooter was confronted in the parking lot. Law enforcement engaged in gunfire, and the suspect was fatally shot. The attack was over, but the devastation was only beginning to be tallied. In those few minutes of terror, at least 4 worshipers were killed outright. 2 others, authorities believe, became trapped in the blaze and perished when the fire consumed parts of the church.
8 more were injured, rushed to hospitals in varying conditions. The chapel itself was a total loss, reduced to charred walls and collapsed beams by the flames. Investigators later told reporters that the quick response almost certainly prevented more deaths. Yet the brutal efficiency of the attack, a truck, a rifle, a fire, underscored just how vulnerable even a prepared community can be when violence erupts without warning. Hundreds of people had gathered for nothing more than faith and fellowship, and in less than 10 minutes, they had been thrust into a nightmare. This was not simply a shooting. It was an attack carried out with layers of violence: vehicular assault, gunfire, and arson. The timeline was short, but its scars will last long. For the people of Grand Blanc, the date September 28th will forever mark the morning when peace was shattered and an ordinary Sunday service became a national tragedy.
Every tragedy like this eventually circles back to one pressing question: who could commit such an act? In Grand Blanc Township, that answer is tied to the name Thomas Jacob Sanford, a 40-year-old man from Burton, Michigan, just a few miles from where the attack unfolded. Sanford's story, as investigators begin to piece it together, is one of contrasts. A man who once wore the uniform of a U.S. Marine, but who ended his life in violence against unarmed civilians inside a place of worship. Sanford was no stranger to military discipline. As an Iraq War veteran, he had been trained to operate under pressure, to handle firearms, and to face combat scenarios. Those skills, once sharpened for service abroad, would on that Sunday morning be turned against his own community. For many who knew him, the connection between the Marine they remembered and the attacker police shot dead in the church parking lot is almost impossible to reconcile. Yet law enforcement says this is the reality. The man who stormed a chapel with an assault rifle had once been sworn to protect his country. Details about Sanford's personal life are still emerging. Reports suggest he lived in Burton, a working-class suburb, and that he had family ties, including a child with a rare genetic disorder. In past years, fundraising appeals and online campaigns had surfaced in connection to his family's struggles, presenting Sanford as a father battling through hardship. This image, a man trying to provide and care, clashes violently with the picture police paint of the suspect who deliberately rammed his truck into a church and lit it ablaze. Investigators are searching his home and seizing his electronic devices, hoping for clues about his mindset, his motivations, and whether he left behind writings or digital footprints that might explain the unthinkable. So far, officials say it appears to be an act of targeted violence, though whether Sanford had a personal connection to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints remains uncertain. Federal authorities, including the FBI and ATF, are treating the case as a high-priority investigation, given the mix of gunfire, fire, and suspected explosives that were reportedly recovered. Neighbors describe Sanford in ways that make the attack even more unsettling. To some, he seemed quiet, perhaps withdrawn, but not overtly threatening. To others, there had been signs of instability, moments that in hindsight now appear like red flags. Like many veterans, Sanford may have carried invisible scars of combat, and questions about his mental health will undoubtedly be part of the investigation. Yet the line between personal struggle and public atrocity is one that few expected him to cross. Law enforcement officers who ended the attack emphasized that Sanford was armed, prepared, and posed an immediate threat. His military background may have helped him plan the assault with precision, combining a vehicle, firearms, fire accelerants, and even possible explosive devices. This was not random chaos. It was orchestrated destruction. The man who once wore a Marine uniform is now remembered not for service, but for bloodshed. His name will forever be associated with a morning of fire, panic, and death. And as investigators dig deeper, the haunting question remains: what transformed Thomas Jacob Sanford from a soldier into the perpetrator of one of Michigan's deadliest church attacks?
Behind every headline, every statistic, and every grim press conference are human beings. The victims of the Grand Blanc Township church attack were not nameless figures. They were mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, friends, and neighbors who gathered that Sunday to worship in peace. Their lives and the way they were torn apart in mere minutes are the reason this story reverberates so deeply through Michigan and across the nation. According to police reports, at least 5 people lost their lives in the attack, though the exact count may still shift as investigators comb through the charred remains of the chapel. 4 of the victims died inside the church during the assault. 2 were confirmed to have been shot by the gunmen, while 2 more are believed to have been trapped when the flames consumed parts of the building. Later, additional bodies were discovered in the rubble, intensifying the grief already sweeping through the community. For authorities, the fact that the structure itself was considered a total loss complicated the recovery efforts. Entire sections of the church collapsed under the weight of fire and water damage, making it a painstaking task to determine whether everyone inside had been accounted for. 8 additional people were injured, rushed to local hospitals, including Henry Ford Health's Genesis Hospital. At least 1 victim succumbed to injuries shortly after arrival, while several remain in critical condition. Others, though stable, are facing long recoveries from wounds sustained by bullets, smoke inhalation, or the chaos of escaping a burning building. For survivors, every cough of smoke, every sudden loud noise, and every reminder of that morning will linger far longer than any physical scar. The aftermath was as heartbreaking as the attack itself. Survivors were evacuated to the nearby NCG Trillium Cinema, which was transformed into a reunification center. There, families waited anxiously, scanning the faces of evacuees, desperate for word of their loved ones. Some were met with tearful reunions, others were met with silence and grim updates from officers. Witnesses described scenes of people collapsing into one another's arms, sobbing and whispering prayers for those still unaccounted for. For members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Grand Blanc, the blow was especially heavy. Places of worship are not just buildings, they are spiritual homes where milestones like baptisms, weddings, and funerals mark the journey of life. One member, overcome with grief, recalled how her daughter had recently been baptized in the very chapel that now stood in ruins. For her and countless others, the emotional toll is not simply about physical destruction, but about the violation of a sacred space that held their most profound moments of faith. Local officials have made clear that the community will rally around those who are grieving. Counselors have been deployed, clergy from neighboring churches have opened their doors, and neighbors who might once have passed casually on the street are now offering food, shelter, and support. Yet even with these gestures of unity, the reality remains stark. Families are left without loved ones, children without parents, and an entire congregation without the building that had anchored their spiritual life. The victims of the Grand Blanc Township church attack will not be remembered as statistics. They will be remembered as individuals whose lives were unjustly cut short. Their absence is felt not only in their homes and in their pews, but also in the collective heart of a shaken community. And in their honor, the demand for answers and for change only grows stronger.
When violence strikes a church, it does not remain confined to 4 walls. The ripples extend outward, from the stunned congregants to local officials scrambling to respond, to state and national leaders who must reckon with what it says about the climate of violence in America today. The Grand Blanc Township church shooting was no exception. Within hours of the tragedy, statements of grief, outrage, and solidarity poured in, underscoring the depth of the wound inflicted not just on one community, but on the entire country. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer was among the first to issue a public statement. She described her heartbreak for the families affected and emphasized that violence in a place of worship is, quote, unacceptable. Her words were both a reflection of sorrow and a call for vigilance, highlighting the surreal reality that a church, a sanctuary of peace and reflection, had become the stage for horror. Whitmer also praised first responders, acknowledging that their swift action undoubtedly prevented a much higher death toll. National attention followed quickly. Former President Donald Trump addressed the attack in a post, framing it as yet another example of what he called a targeted attack on Christians in the United States of America. He referred to the violence as part of an epidemic that must be stopped immediately, urging prayers for the victims and their families. His statement carried a political charge, turning the tragedy into a flashpoint in the ongoing national conversation about faith, safety, and violence. Beyond the political responses, federal agencies mobilized rapidly. The FBI assumed leadership of the investigation, working in conjunction with local and state police. More than 100 federal agents were dispatched, joined by specialized units from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF. Their tasks ranged from clearing the rubble for potential explosive devices, to interviewing witnesses, to securing electronic evidence that might reveal the shooter's motives. The official designation of the event as an act of targeted violence elevated its seriousness in the eyes of both law enforcement and the public. At the community level, reaction was raw and emotional. Local leaders like Township Supervisor Scott Bennett expressed devastation, stating that this kind of violence doesn't happen in our community, and vowing to support the victims' families in every possible way. Clergy from nearby churches, regardless of denomination, offered prayers and pledged solidarity, recognizing that the attack was not only on one faith group, but on the very idea of sacred gathering places. Ordinary residents, too, were shaken. Some described hearing sirens from miles away and rushing toward the scene to see how they could help, only to be met with blocked roads and smoke rising above the church. Others spoke through tears at the reunification site, struggling to find words to capture the enormity of what had happened. Social media flooded with messages of grief, prayers, and calls for accountability. The reactions extended far beyond Michigan. National media outlets carried live updates, while religious organizations across the country released statements of sympathy and condemnation. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in particular, issued a message of gratitude for first responders, while calling on members to remain strong in faith. Quote, "Places of worship are meant to be sanctuaries of peacemaking, prayer, and connection," one spokesperson said, stressing the importance of resilience in the face of hatred and violence. In every statement, whether from politicians, clergy, or grieving community members, one theme was clear: disbelief that such violence could happen in a place meant for peace, and determination that the victims' lives would not be forgotten. Yet beneath the outpouring of sympathy lies a sobering undercurrent, an acknowledgement that this attack is not an isolated event, but part of a troubling pattern where houses of worship increasingly find themselves vulnerable to violence.
Every tragedy forces a reckoning. The attack on the Grand Blanc Township Church was not only a devastating local event, but also a lens into broader issues that the United States can no longer afford to ignore. This is not the first time a congregation has been targeted, and unless deeper questions are addressed, it likely will not be the last. The incident compels Americans, leaders, communities, and individuals alike to examine how faith, security, and social fractures collide in modern life. One of the most immediate questions centers on security in places of worship. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples are designed to be open spaces, welcoming to strangers and longtime members alike. They are spiritual havens where suspicion at the door feels out of place. But in an era where attackers have deliberately chosen houses of worship to stage violence, the tension between openness and safety grows sharper. Should congregations hire armed guards, install metal detectors, or enforce stricter entry procedures? For many faith leaders, these measures seem antithetical to the sacred mission of their institutions, yet the alternative, vulnerability to armed intruders, carries its own moral and practical weight. The attack also reignites debate about veterans, mental health, and reintegration into civilian life. The shooter, Thomas Jacob Sanford, was a Marine and Iraq War veteran. While his exact mental state remains under investigation, the fact that a trained serviceman turned his skills inward on his community raises uncomfortable truths. How well does the nation support those returning from combat? Are resources for trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and reintegration sufficient? And when cracks appear, are warning signs missed until it is too late? Then there's the weaponry itself. The suspect carried an assault-style rifle,
a firearm capable of inflicting mass casualties in minutes. Combined with accelerants to set the church ablaze and even suspected explosive devices, the attack was not spontaneous but premeditated and layered. Incidents like this reignite familiar debates about gun access, regulation, and the balance between Second Amendment rights and public safety. The discussion is not new, but each tragedy adds new urgency, especially when sacred spaces are violated. Beyond policy debates lies the spiritual and cultural impact. Faith communities across the country will undoubtedly look at Grand Blanc and wonder, could this happen to us? The notion that a service meant to uplift the soul could end in gunfire shakes the foundation of what it means to gather freely in worship. This erosion of perceived safety forces many to rethink how they interact with their faith communities, whether to bring their children, whether to volunteer, whether to walk into a building that should symbolize peace without first scanning for threats. Finally, the Grand Blanc Township attack speaks to the growing climate of division and violence in America. Whether the shooter was motivated by ideology, personal grievances, or psychological breakdown, the outcome is the same. Ordinary citizens caught in the crossfire of larger fractures. In a society increasingly polarized, where rhetoric often fuels extremism, places once thought untouchable, schools, synagogues, mosques, and now again churches, become stages for violence. The broader implication is sobering. Safety is no longer assumed, even in sacred spaces. Communities must grapple with how to adapt without losing the very openness that defines them. Policymakers, law enforcement, and faith leaders must navigate the balance between protection and freedom. And as the investigation unfolds, families of victims are left with the heaviest burden of all, living with loss that no policy, no statement, and no debate can ever fully repair. The attack in Grand Blanc Township is not only about the horror of a single morning. It is a mirror, reflecting the urgent challenges facing a nation struggling with violence, division, and the search for meaning in the aftermath of tragedy.
The Grand Blanc Township church attack leaves us with more than a crime scene. It leaves us with grief, questions, and the sobering reminder that no community, however peaceful, is beyond the reach of violence. The victims' families now face futures without loved ones, and survivors carry memories that will haunt them long after the cameras move on. But tragedy also demands a response. Communities cannot simply recoil in fear. They must find ways to rebuild, to strengthen bonds, and to ensure that faith spaces remain what they were always intended to be, sanctuaries of peace, prayer, and connection. That begins with conversation. Talk with your congregation, your neighbors, your friends. Ask how safety can be improved, how vigilance can be maintained, and how compassion can be extended to those most deeply hurt. It also requires reflection on a national scale. How are veterans supported after combat? How are weapons regulated and secured? How are communities prepared to respond when violence strikes in unexpected places? These are not abstract questions. They are urgent and practical, brought into focus by the events in Michigan. For viewers, the next steps are clear. Stay informed. Share accurate information so the victims are remembered not just as statistics, but as lives cut short. Support organizations offering trauma counseling, community rebuilding, and veteran care. And yes, engage with coverage like this, not for sensationalism, but to keep attention on the issues that matter. If you found this breakdown valuable, consider subscribing to this channel. Here, we don't just skim headlines, we dig into them with clarity, detail, and urgency. Hit the like button to help others discover this story, and share it so more people can understand the depth of what happened. Above all, carry forward the reminder that violence cannot define us. Communities can choose resilience, compassion, and vigilance. The lives lost in Grand Blanc Township deserve nothing less.